Hello, my name is Abby Linville, and this is my Module 12 case study. This case study is about a principal who is completing a formal evaluation on a teacher named Mrs. Stevens. Mrs. Stevens has really strong content knowledge, but when the principal goes into her classroom to observe her, what is noticed is that she is doing a lot of teacher lecturing and not a lot of student involvement in their learning, that she has struggles with classroom management, specifically with student engagement and student motivation. When meeting about her observation in post-observation conferences, she becomes very defensive and places blame on having someone else in the room and that the students don't usually and always act like that. And she's just really defensive and irritable when it comes to getting some negative feedback. The feedback that is being provided to her is vague and is just telling her what's not going well, but isn't giving her any specific actionable steps that she can take going forward. The principal completes a couple observations on Mrs. Stephen, and after his second observation in her classroom during the evaluation process, the principal does not see any improvements taking place and decides to not renew Mrs. Stevens' contract. When Mrs. Stevens views the formal evaluation and meets with the principal, she is obviously upset because her contract is not being renewed, and she expresses complaints that she does not believe she's been provided with adequate support, and therefore she does not think that her evaluation is fair, and that she is willing to take it to court if her contract is not renewed to have her contract reinstated because she doesn't feel like she was provided the support needed this year, and that her evaluation would then be deemed unfair going forward. So when we're looking at the situation and considering the legal and ethical issues, no laws have been broken at this time, but Mrs. Stevens' contract was not renewed, and she feels like it was not renewed in an unfair way. She does not feel like her formal evaluation was thorough and that she was provided with an opportunity to improve her instruction. So some major questions to ask throughout this case study, and that needs to be answered to ensure that there was an understanding about what this evaluation process looked like was she in fact provided with adequate supervision? And what does that formal evaluation system look like in the school system? And I think it's also worth looking at the district's negotiated agreement as well, and making sure that that formal evaluation followed all the guidelines in the negotiated agreement. So if I had to summarize what's happening in this case study in one sentence, I would say that Mrs. Stevens feels that she has not been provided with the supervision or the support needed to justify a fair teacher evaluation. So here are the facts of the case. The people that are involved are the principal, Mrs. Stevens, and the students. The students are the main people who are being affected in this situation because if they're not receiving the effective instruction that they deserve, that's an issue. Mrs. Stevens also in her post-observation conference made note that she didn't feel like she was getting any information from her supervisor about some actionable steps to take in her classroom. So there is definitely a supervisor of some sort involved in the situation as well. Most of the situations that are taking place within Mrs. Stevens' classroom and through classroom observations being completed by the principal, and conversations that are taking place through the post-observation conference. We don't know much about the school itself, what the makeup of the school is, if it's a public or private, or if it's an elementary or a secondary school. We just know that it's taking place in a classroom setting. We do know that because it was noted by the principal that if he were to renew her contract, Mrs. Stevens' contract this year, that she would then be under tenure. So we know that the school has a tenure process. We also know that they have some sort of formal evaluation process. We were able to see the evaluation form. I do want to note that that form was pretty vague. It was just a checklist and just rated the teacher as below average, average, or above average. So it was very vague and didn't provide much opportunity for a principal to provide reasoning to a teacher for non-renewal. Most of that would have been laid out in the conversation, but there wasn't any specific things noted or to look for in that evaluation process. I also believe, because she mentioned the supervisor, that there may be some type of mentor, like supervisor type of program going on, or like a head of the department if it's a secondary classroom, that might be providing feedback to her as well as a peer. So I wanted to prioritize the key information for this case study. I think one of the main things that's focused on is the potential lawsuit if Mrs. Stevens loses her contract and decides to pursue it. I think another priority are the students, and the ineffective instruction could continue if Mrs. Stevens stays in the classroom and the students aren't getting fully what they deserve if they're not having an effective teacher. I think that anytime that you're dealing with a teacher being disgruntled or upset, it can have an effect on the school community, and vice versa. If you were to allow that teacher to stay, it can also have an effect on the community as well. So I think just keeping an eye on the community as a whole is important. The superintendent definitely needs to be informed of what's going on because of the potential for a lawsuit. I think we also need to make sure to go back and look at what observation records did the school principal take, and are there any there? And then what type of feedback was provided besides what was mentioned in the case study? So here are some options to handle this situation. The first option would be to not renew Mrs. Stevens' contract and just move forward as stated. Two would be to renew her contract and then provide her with no follow-up, and just because she made the threat of a lawsuit, just to go ahead and let her move forward in the school. Option three would be to collaborate with the supervisor that was mentioned in the post-observation conference to see if the supervisor and the principal can collaborate to provide Ms. Stevens with a more thorough evaluation that kind of lays out the key information for why she was not being renewed, why her contract was not being renewed. That way she would understand going forward what changes she would need to make in her next future job and why. I think she's confused on why her contract's not being renewed, so giving her a more thorough evaluation and really laying that out would be really important. Option four would be to reflect as a principal on the feedback that was provided. To think about, was it vague? Was I not giving her actionable feedback that would really help support her in making changes in her classroom? And then after reflecting on that feedback, talking to the superintendent and seeing, is it an option to provide a 1-year extension? So that 1-year extension would mean that her contract would be renewed for 1 year only, and she would not be guaranteed tenure. So looking at the pros and cons of each option, for option one, which is the taking no action and continuing with the non-renewal, the pros of that is you could hire a teacher that will probably be more effective and will lead to higher student success in the classroom. And I think that it would help you create a more positive climate in that classroom and within your school system. I think the cons of it is that you have a potential legal issue if you could not justify the non-renewal of Mrs. Stevens' contract. Option two would be to renew Mrs. Stevens' contract and have no follow-up, just to renew her contract and move forward and allow her to have tenure. The pros of this would be there would be no threat of a legal issue. The con is that you're going to have a huge effect on student achievement. I also think it sets a bad precedence going forward that if a teacher does not like their evaluation and their feedback, that if they push you on it and threaten legal action, that you'll automatically fold. And it also just shows a lack of follow through. So I think some of those cons are really huge and big, and things that you want to definitely consider. Option three would be to collaborate with a supervisor to provide a more thorough evaluation. I think the pros of this is that you could give that specific reasoning to her for why she's not being renewed, and you could also show that documentation of support. The risk and con of this is I'm not sure if that documentation is there or not. Option 4 would be to reflect as a principal on that feedback and decide if that 1-year extension is an option. The pros are it would provide an opportunity to give Mrs. Stephen that feedback that she deserves and to help to build her capacity as a teacher, because maybe with some targeted specific feedback, she would really flourish and grow. It's definitely going to allow you to support her, and I think it's also providing an opportunity to really look at and revamp the evaluation process, because it's looking like it's really unclear right now and doesn't have a specific protocol and steps. And I think this would be an opportunity to make sure that you could improve it going forward so you could avoid these situations in the future. The cons would be that student success could be affected, and that you could be in a similar position to this next school year if Mrs. Stevens doesn't make any improvements. And Mrs. Stevens could also say she doesn't agree with the 1-year extension option as well. So when looking at this and weighing the pros and cons of each option, I automatically know that I think continuing with the non-renewal and taking no action is a last resort and not something I would jump to first. Renewing her contract and not following up with a plan and looking at improving her instruction is not an option for me. I think it's too much of a risk on student achievement. I think collaborating with the supervisor to provide a more thorough evaluation is something that may work, but I think that I honestly don't think it looks like in the case study that that documentation would be there. I think option number 4 is the best option because it gives an opportunity to make a change to the system as a whole so that this situation could be avoided in the future. And it also gives a chance to give the teacher more thorough, targeted, specific feedback so she can improve as well. So here are the steps for implementation. The first step is to contact the superintendent and inform him of what the situation is. During that conversation, I would also ask about, is a 1-year contract an option? I'm hoping that that would be an option going forward and would still fit in the negotiated agreement. If it does not, then unfortunately, I think it's too big of a risk to keep a teacher that would be tenured after this year who may not be open to making improvements on your staff, because it would really take a hit on student achievement. So then I would have to go back and choose option 2, which would be not to renew her contract. And with that, I would also go back and make sure that I provide some specific documentation. But if we can get that 1-year contract, I think it's really important, because even though there's a risk involved with it, it also will lead to changes in the future that will be better so this won't happen again. So let's say we get that 1-year contract approved. Then I would review the evaluation process with the superintendent and add in some key components and provide a protocol for how often we're observing and how often we're providing feedback to teachers, and making sure that we have plans for putting support in for them and providing them with professional learning to help them develop their skills. After doing that, I would meet with Ms. Stevens and communicate this new plan to her and make sure she fully understands the 1-year contract that she'll be under, and that clearly communicate to her what your expectations are for her as a successful teacher in her classroom and what that new process will look like. I will also inform her of that the new plan will be put into place in that upcoming new school year. And then at the end of the next year, I would evaluate how her improvement has taken place and decide if she will be on a 10-year contract or if we will non-renew her contract going forward. I think providing her with that opportunity to build capacity and improve is so important. And I think making changes to the teacher evaluation system as a whole is also important, so that you have a strong system in place to provide teachers with feedback going forward. Thank you for listening to my case study.